everyone. We are live here on CBC News Instagram. We're going to be joined today by CBC News science reporter Johanna Wagstaffe. So I'll be inviting her into this live as soon as I see her. But any questions you have about COP26, Johanna and I are here. Oh, I see Johanna.
There she is.
Hi.
Hi, Johanna. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. So Johanna and I are actually both at COP26 here in Glasgow, but we haven't actually seen each other in person yet.
I know. Isn't that funny? It just goes to show you how much is going on. But yeah, it's nice to see you.
It's been busy for sure. So I'm Avneet Dillon. I'm with the CBC News social team. This is Johanna Wagstaffe, who I'm sure many of you already know. She is our science reporter and meteorologist based in Vancouver. We're both here at COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, United Kingdom. And we're going to be answering all of your questions about COP26, about climate science. And Johanna is our science expert, so she's ready to take all of your questions. We actually got some in advance from you guys on Instagram, so we're going to start with those. So Johanna, Ira on Instagram asked us, what is COP26 and why is it important?
I think that's such a great question, Avneet, because this is why we're all here. You know, I'm in the middle of the conference center. People are heading home for the day. People are working long hours. People have flown here from all around the world. The reason why there's been so much attention on COP26 is it's really being called the last chance for action. The science shows us that in order to keep global warming down below 1.5 degrees, action has to happen by 2030. And right now, with our current pledges and current actions in place, we'll actually see greenhouse gas emissions increase to 16%. We need to drop it by 46%. That's a big gap, and we only have 9 years to get to 2030, and that's why now is being called the last chance.
And speaking of that 1.5 degree target, there was a report released recently by Climate Action Tracker. They published an analysis that says the world is actually on track to warm 2.4 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. So essentially this report is saying whatever this goal is that was agreed to at the Paris Agreement in 2015, we're not going to meet it. We're already moving in the opposite direction. So some people then are asking, why then have COP? What is the purpose of this?
Yeah, and I've been talking to people on the ground, you know, people actually in these meeting rooms working through the details of this final report. There's sort of two threads happening at COP, and it's an interesting reminder. This is where a lot of pledges happen. This is where the final draft will happen. And it's also a sort of a trades show. So there's a lot going on. But ultimately, that final draft has to work out the nuts and bolts of how we're going to get to 1.5. And yes, you're right. Right now, all of these pledges that are happening bring our temperatures to 2.4. Right now, we've already warmed 1.2. So we know anything over 2 is drastic. We also know 1.5 is still drastic, but at least it means a possibility for our island nations. But we still have time to work out those details. I know we're getting into the last 2 days, Avneet, but I have heard from people behind the scenes that incremental progress is happening.
And going off of that, Catherine on Instagram also sent us a question. She asked, how bad will it get if we don't meet our climate targets? Is there any hope we can recover?
Such an important question, you know, because it's really easy when we hear these reports and the latest science to say, well, it's already too late. You know, what's the point? But every 10th of a degree matters. You know, we've already warned 1.2. We've already seen those effects come through in our extreme weather events here in Canada. But the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is massive. You know, warming to 1.5 degrees means that half of the world's population will face extreme climate hazards. Warming to 2, add another 1 billion people to that number. So the difference between 1.5 and 2 is great. And that's why, you know, even if we can't get to 1.5, 1.6 is better than 1.7, et cetera, et cetera. So every 10th of a degree counts.
And I should mention that our CBC News social team actually produced a video that's on our Instagram page. If you scroll down a bit, you'll find it. And it explains what that 0.5 degree of difference, how much of a difference that can really make between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So I recommend anyone watching, if you're interested, to go watch that. Next question we got in advance from Instagram. have any of the protesters been given a chance to voice their ideas? Is there funding to support their ideas? So this is from Elliot. I will just say that I've been speaking to protesters here and, climate activists from all over the world, and some of them have been frustrated by what they call an inaccessible conference. They say they haven't been able to get into the room in certain cases. What have you found, Johanna?
Yeah, Avni, you've really been on the ground sort of where all that action's happening, whereas in the conference center, this is where people do have a seat at the table. So that's really why this counter climate conference kicked off on Sunday, to share those ideas. And yes, you're right. I'm hearing from the inside, they wish that there was more room for everyone at the table. And there's been a lot of questions about accessibility around this COP, even with the added layer of COVID. Hearing yesterday was the big day for the island nations, asking for loss and damage compensation. And I was hearing that the Bahamas couldn't even get into the room because it was so busy because of COVID layers. So yeah, that gap is widening as far as who can and who can't have access. But that counter climate conference is really creating a buzz. And actually I'm headed there tomorrow to the Green Zone to kind of look at that side of things. So we're hoping that that'll spur ambition, across leaders.
I just want to get to some of the questions we've been getting live here. So we got one from Active by Nature Canmore. They asked, will Canada's commitment put a stop to mining the Alberta Rockies for coal?
That is definitely a big talker after the pledge last week. When the pledge announcement first came out from the federal government, I think immediately there were questions about what the details were. And, a few days later, we now know that it's capping pollutions and leakages and emissions, not necessarily production. So I think there is still a lot of details to work out, and that has been a huge sticking point for Canada. We also had another tracker released today, a global climate tracker, trying to figure out where Canada places as far as our policies and our funds so far. And globally, this scientific analysis found that we were highly insufficient because of that exact point. So very much still a sticking point as we head into week 2.
And I just want to remind people watching, Johanna and I are answering any of your questions about COP26, the climate change conference happening here in Glasgow, as well as any of your climate policy questions, climate science questions. We actually got some questions emailed us to our Ask team. People emailed ask@cbc.ca, which you can continue to do if you have any questions about our stories. But I'm going to say this question from Evan G, who emailed Ask. He said, what is the reason COP26 cannot be held over Skype? So this is one that we actually got a lot. Why are people flying into this conference? Why can't you do this over Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, etc.? A lot of people have been working from home. Why can't it happen? Do you want to take that first, and then I'll add to your answer?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts too, Avneet. But from what I'm hearing, there are 40,000 participants right now in the at COP26, and this conference was already pushed back 1 year. They thought about doing it online last year amid COVID, but decided to push it forward because countries didn't want to do this online. They wanted to meet face to face. I've been to 2 previous COPs, and it truly is in these meeting rooms where you are sitting across from someone telling them why you need their country to divest from fossil fuels, because your country won't exist if they don't. And, hearing from people on the ground today, they're saying things are getting done. It's incremental, but it's because they're talking face to face. They're running into people in the hallways as they head to the next meeting, finding out something they didn't realize, adding that into their agenda. I've been working from home myself 1.5 years, and I am reminded, Avneet, how important face to face is when we're talking about something this big. How about you?
Yeah, I heard the same thing. As what I heard actually was that a lot of developing nations didn't want a virtual conference. There's technological challenges in some countries, and then you also have to account for the difference in time zones, and things get lost in translation. And so we really underestimate how much can be accomplished in person versus virtual. But I think there's a separate thing that people have been talking about, which is that, these people who are coming here on private jets and, that sort of thing. And so I think those are valid questions for sure. Getting to some more questions here. Tanosaurus actually sent us an interesting question. She, along these lines, has there been a change since there is a trend in more people working from home, meaning less cars on the road?
So we did actually see a big global drop in the first drop in CO2 emissions globally that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution during COVID. It was just a small drop in our CO2 emissions, but it was the first one we'd seen in some time. And I've also seen dozens of other scientific studies from countries all around the world analyzing ground level pollution, smog, all of these big factors that make up our emissions, and they all dropped during COVID, just during those initial lockdowns. Even with the in the recent months, the opening up has meant we are right back to where we started before COVID, and in fact, it looks like we're going to surpass that by at least 16% from where we were before. So it was a drop, and I think it reminded a lot of people of what we can do working together. I've heard that from scientists, but it wasn't a long-term impact.
I want to bring in another question we got in advance on Instagram. K Sweets asked, why can't we stop cutting down forests immediately? Now, this is something, you're based in BC. This is a big issue there. So what's the answer to K Sweets' question there? Yeah,
it's such an interesting question. And I'm actually attending, a BC in the Green Zone tomorrow. We'll have people from BC protesting against what's happening right now in BC with our old growth forests. As far as why we can't cut them all down at once, I've talked to a lot of scientists, especially from the University of Northern British Columbia, with a lot of ties to the lumber industry. Everything we do is connected to products from lumber. So, production for basically everything we use would just cease if we were to stop cutting down all trees. But I think what's important is to realize that cutting down old and large trees and the mass cutting down of trees, and also considering what trees we plant in its place. The climate is already changing, and so scientists are talking about needing to plant trees that'll survive in a climate 50 years from now. So it's about how we do it and what kind of trees we cut down. But yeah, you're not the only one asking that question about why it all can't cease at once.
And I want to bring in another question that we had emailed to us at ask@cbc.ca. Sean A. emailed to ask, has anyone even spoken about the impact overpopulation has on climate? More people means more carbon.
That has been incorporated into all of our studies that look at the impacts of global warming on the future. When we say things like 2 degrees equals 2 billion people who will be heat stressed, that accounts for population increase, and all of our modeling and our climate modeling does include that population increase. But you're right, our numbers are soaring, and that's why climate refugees and migration because of extreme climate stresses is also a big concern in our warming future.
So we got a question from Wagner on Instagram in advance of this live. He said, where was Russia? Where was China at this conference?
So the leaders were not here. Last week was sort of when all the heads of state came to make their pledges, sort of demonstrating their commitment to climate change. And yes, notably absent China and Russia. Interestingly, though, their negotiators and delegates are here this week from both countries, working behind the scenes. I've heard from people on the ground that not having their leaders here is a sign that they're not expected to commit a lot, but then also hearing from Chinese delegates that they're working hard and they're disappointed that other countries didn't pledge more. So yes, definitely some disparity there. But even, when Obama spoke a couple of days ago, he voiced his disappointment in the leaders not being here, especially since they are the top emitters.
100%, yeah. And so I think a lot of headlines were saying, the leaders of these countries are not here. But I remember I ran into an Australian journalist the other day who was really frustrated by that. He said, China is here. It's just that the leader isn't here, but they certainly are here in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to get to another question. Helen S. asked us, what is being done in BC to prevent wildfires, and what is being done to replant the trees lost?
With wildfires, yeah, I've spoken to a lot of experts about this, and I think in the past couple of years, our back-to-back wildfire seasons, last year's devastating wildfire season lit and burning down. I think leaders across the board and through the government are realizing we need to turn to Indigenous stewardship. Basically, up until now, the past 50, 60 years, our solution to fighting fires was to put them all out. So we have all of this underbrush that has grown in, and speaking to specialists, we need to pre-burn that before the season starts. And that's how Indigenous cultures managed their land. So there's now, we're beginning to make that connection again, but that is the future, more burning before the season starts, so we don't have all of this fuel available on the forest floor. As far as forestry, again, going back to that issue of needing to understand what we're cutting and what we're replanting. So a lot of science behind both of these issues.
And I just want to remind everyone again, we're taking your questions about COP26 and climate science, so you can leave them in the comments. Audrey asked us here on Instagram, how are countries and corporations being held accountable to their goals?
This is a huge part of COP26, especially this year. After Paris, I think the credibility of many countries on the table. We didn't do what we said we did from Paris. We didn't reach that climate fund. We haven't dropped emissions. And so credibility and accountability is a huge part of that final document. We need to figure out how countries are going to report where they're at, reducing their emissions, and we need to monitor those emissions. And this year we've got something different that we didn't have in Paris: satellite technology. We had satellites before, but now we have rapid processing. That means we can actually, we as in the scientists, can monitor global emissions in real time. So we can say when a country or even a particular business is not meeting the goals promised, and that might be a game changer.
Bookham on Instagram here, I'm seeing, sent a question. He said, what's the most interesting or exciting climate change mitigation project you've seen at COP26?
That's a really interesting question, because there is a big difference between mitigation and adaptation. COP26 is about mitigating climate change, so stopping the emission of greenhouse gases and keeping our temperature down. But on the side, we also have to adapt to the warming world that will continue to warm no matter what. It just depends, how much it warms. But on the mitigation side, I will say that it's a big topic in Canada is carbon capture. I know, we've done stories recently on the National about carbon capture plants. Squamish, just north of Vancouver, has a big one, Iceland. So this idea that you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, storing it underground, helping to keep those emissions down. I think for me as a scientist, I feel conflicted, because it almost borders on geoengineering, which is somewhere where for most scientists, they don't want that to be the solution. But it is fascinating to see it work and see that it is working in Squamish. So that's one that I'll be following for sure.
And I should mention, because you mentioned, the Indigenous activists who are here at COP26, we're actually going to be doing a live Q&A with Indigenous Climate Action this Friday on the last day of the conference. So stay tuned for that. And if you have any questions, be sure to join that live. Harmandeep asked a question here. He asked, is it better to use sustainably produced wood for construction rather than concrete and steel? Not necessarily COP26 related, but do you have an answer to that, Johanna?
Well, funny enough, I, for a podcast I did a few years ago about climate change in British Columbia, talked to an expert on that very topic, Stephen Shepherd from UBC. I asked him what a sustainable world would look like, and building with wood was something that he said, the footprint of using wood is so much less than concrete, and it lasts so much longer, but it also helps insulate the home so much better. He had a list of reasons why, if done properly, again, going back to the question of logging and how you do that in a smart way. But yes, wood over concrete.
Okay, there you go. E. Porter is asking, has anyone talked about carbon capture at the source?
Yes, interesting. I don't have specific details, unfortunately, but I do remember looking into projects in Alberta where they had looked at putting that carbon capture right at the source. So I know it's being talked about. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what level it's at right now. But, Alberta is seeing the fastest growing switch over to green energy technology. So look for innovation there.
And, we've been getting a lot of questions also sort of asking us to predict what's going to happen. But a lot of people have been asking, what's going to come out of COP26 this year. So, Johanna, what is it looking like to you?
That is the big question. And, we had a little bit of a hint of it today. I got a chance to read through what's called the presidency's non-paper. It's basically a paper issued to everyone working on this final draft, showing where it seems to be headed. And, my experience in Paris and Copenhagen, this is often an indicator of what the final draft will look like. And people were not happy with it today. It did not include messaging about rapid transition away from fossil fuels. And that's ultimately what we were, what everyone was really hoping for as far as reaching that 1.5 goal. And through my experience, as the drafts get nearer to the end, it gets more watered down because all the countries have to agree on that language. So not likely to see that in the final draft, but again, it's still days ahead. They were really only bullet points rather than the kind of massive text we will see in a few days. So, I'm hopeful that we're going to see real change come out of this. I don't know if it's going to be reflected in the text on Friday night or, early hours of Saturday. But going back to what you're tracking, Avneet, on the ground, I think it's the youth movement, it's the Indigenous groups, it's the grassroots movement who, might help close that gap and spur ambition after COP26.
And I'm seeing a question related to this from Active by Nature Canmore. They asked, Greenpeace posted that the draft text for the Glasgow final document is very weak with no mention of fossil fuel phase out. What are you hearing, Johanna?
Yeah, so I looked at that report from Greenpeace, and that leaked draft they're talking about is that presidency non-paper. So it was actually a public paper to the delegates, and I had somebody on the ground share it with me. But yes, the point is the same, that there was disappointment that it was weak.
Okay, and just reminding everyone that we are taking your questions about COP26 and climate science. Not seeing any new ones. If I missed your question, please post it again.
I should mention, I'm seeing a few comments about my poppy that just fell off, and I've got my camera flipped, so that's why it was on the other side.
Okay, yes, I got the same comment.
Yes.
The camera is flipped, so I am wearing it on the left side.
Thank you, yes.
But overall, how has your experience been here at COP26, Johanna? Like, has anything surprised you? I know you've obviously been to COP conferences before. This is my first one. How does it compare?
I would say that it is overwhelming in a different way. From a positive note, I think, many media and groups around the world have turned to climate change in a way that they never have before. We're seeing pledges like we never did in Paris. We're seeing urgency like we never did in Paris. But with the added layer of COVID and with all of these extra things, it's made it very hard to distill the information. I'm hearing that from the people working on that draft. It's confusing to know which meeting room to be in. They're hearing pledges about their own country that they didn't hear firsthand. They're not able to get into conference rooms because of COVID protocols, or having to hear secondhand. So I think there's a lot more layers this year for me. But again, the urgency and all of the side, the counter climate movement, there's a lot more hope going on behind the scene. I would say Copenhagen was hopeful and it was a failure. I've heard people say that Paris was like the engagement to a wedding. It was like the engagement announcement, and then now we're at the wedding, and we need the bride and groom to sign in 3 days.
Another question from Bookham here asking, you mentioned mitigation and adaptation. Obviously, both are necessary to meet targets, but which do scientists think is most important?
Good question. I've thought a lot about this because the solutions can be one and the same often. So, again, the idea that mitigating is tools and policy to stop greenhouse gases that will stop our planet from warming, whereas adapting is technology and often infrastructure plans to adapt to the warming world that we already know will happen. Even if we cut carbon emissions completely to zero right now, our Earth will still warm because of the CO2 that's in the climate. So we need to adapt to it. And I think often the same things that will help you mitigate, to reduce our carbon, even just in new buildings, thinking about keeping a building with a net zero carbon output, those same tools will help you adapt to a warming future. So I think thinking about them in the same way is probably what scientists are most hopeful people will do.
And I saw a question from Neopet on Instagram here. He's asking about rivers and ocean pollution, green hydrogen economy. So I'm not sure what his question is specifically, but he's just asking about those two things.
I mean, if I'm not sure if this is what you were thinking, but there's a lot of work when it comes to renewable energy in rivers, like and tidal mechanisms. I'm not sure if that's where you're going, but there are a lot of untapped resources when it comes to green energy. So, we've got wind, we've got solar, but tidal is a huge one. Anything that's constantly flowing or moving that the earth is providing to us is definitely being explored when it comes to green technology.
And Danny and the Man on Instagram has an interesting question. He's asking, how would you compare the success and failure of science communication on COVID and climate change?
Yeah, very interesting question, and one that I've thought a lot about in the past year. I think COVID has shown the world that in many cases it was success listening to scientists. We listened to scientists about how to protect ourselves and how to move forward through the pandemic, and ultimately we were successful in coming up with a vaccination, in locking down fairly quickly by listening to the science. But where we failed was that we didn't work globally, and that's why we ended up seeing third and fourth waves, and we ended up with countries around the world that we're still dealing with who don't have the vaccinations, who are still suffering. And I think that message can really be translated to climate change. We listen to the scientists. We've got there. We all believe in, it's unequivocal that climate change is happening and it's caused by humans. But what we haven't done is worked globally. We haven't helped those developed nations. We haven't created that fund, and that's where we failed. So yeah, big similarities there.
And Murray here on Instagram is asking, what is the most effective way to reduce CO2 and essentially force a significant reduction?
The biggest contributor to emissions is through the fossil fuel industry. The science is clear, so moving away from the fossil fuel industry, it has the biggest impact. But every industry sort of needs to commit to decarbonize on their own. We had big announcements today from the health industry, globally pledging to decarbonize. Just think about all the fossil fuel dependency that giant health centers and ambulances have. So every industry has to do it in their own way, but it's all about moving away from fossil fuels and methane, which was a big announcement last week.
And I should have mentioned there was a report that came out earlier this week. I'm forgetting the organization behind it. Maybe you can remind me, Johanna, but they found that there's actually more delegates here from the fossil fuel industry than from any single country represented at the conference. So I believe Brazil has the largest country delegation with just under 500 delegates. And yet there are more than 500 delegates from the fossil fuel industry, which a lot of people think, well, what kind of COP is that?
Yeah, and we did also learn that same report, sort of a watchdog agency found that one of Canada's official delegates is a fossil fuel lobbyist. So yeah, lots of questions there.
I think that about wraps it up for us, but any last words, Johanna, before we sign off here? Again, I do want to tell our audience, if you have any questions that we didn't get to, you can email ask@cbc.ca. Any questions that you have about COP26 or climate change, we'll try to get you answers. And those questions and comments really help inform our coverage here at CBC News. But Johanna, we'll give you the last word.
It was just a pleasure to chat to everyone today, and I'll be around on all forms of social media to answer questions as they come up. But I'm also just really glad that I'm here as a scientist on the ground, and I think that really shows our commitment to climate change coverage. I was actually chatting with a couple of other meteorologists earlier today from the US, and it's sort of many scientists first time here representing news organizations. So keep the science questions coming.
Great. Thanks, Johanna, and bye, everyone.